Okay, go.
So I'm trying to pull our Athenian friends into the conversation when reckoning with what's the right level of intelligibility at which to reckon this problem and the scope of the problem. And the answer as to what is the prime value that ought to be governing our response to plague and pandemic
Yeah.
is actually, I don't think it would be to Socrates. It's not obvious. And the fact that we've taken it as presumptive that it is obvious is a fascinating thing to begin with. And I think it's actually, without claiming to know the answer to the question, it's frightening too.
Totally. Well, this is just to give some. So as usual, we've been talking, all day before we press record. But I was, just to fill everyone in on what we're talking about. So we were talking about COVID and the response to COVID, and I was kind of telling Chris a story about that. Oh, there's this one thing about that I didn't quite think of when I was watching an interview where somebody brought up that there's a precedent set that wasn't supposed to be possible, which is the world basically came together basically through government, like democratic systems for the most part, um, and paused the economy, paused all the things about production, paused all of the things that make the world go around. And COVID didn't do that, right? It was a decision made across the world. And so this guy was pointing out, like, oh, whoa, that's the first time the mania of the market, right, was able to actually stop and dramatically stop. And then, all these consequences. And then Chris asked me, well, what do you actually think about that? Like, what happens in you? And I was like, well, I'm not, I had my own response. And then Chris was like, and when he said it, I realized that I was in the effect of it as well, because I hadn't seen this, which was basically, it's gone unquestioned that health, right, and the threat to physical life, right, our physical life, when unquestioned that we're going to stop everything, right, and the whole world stopped, as if human health, right, was the most important thing, and basically was on top of the hierarchy or close to it, close enough to it. And you're not saying that shouldn't be the case, right? That's not what's being said here. It's saying that it's the case, and that it's kind of like assumed that that's the case.
Yeah.
And I was
Yeah.
like, oh yeah, I guess I was assuming that too. It's gone
Well,
unquestioned.
and I've had my moments of assuming that as well. And I think many people whose first reaction was to immediately fear for the well-being of the lives of somebody that they loved,
Yeah.
it was easy to default to that. Of course it was easy to default to that.
Yeah.
And such is the power and imminence and immediacy of that reaction, that it actually takes a fair degree of, I think, philosophic effort to even playfully, even as an exercise, dissociate from that perspective long enough to see it as though from outside of it. I was talking to, I had a really great chat with Sevilla King yesterday. We were talking about this for a while, and talking about this in the language of Pirsig's qualities, metaphysicals of quality, static quality versus dynamic quality, which I won't retrace here because it was a great conversation in its own right. But I think the thing that has become more and more obvious to me is precisely that it is not obvious. Philosophically, it is not at all obvious to me that the health of the body is the prime value, the prime superordinating value around which to organize our relationship to reality and our relationship to one another and our relationship to the world. Socrates would not have drank the hemlock,
Yeah. Yeah.
right, if such a thing were obvious, right? We've been reading these Platonic, we haven't read the Phaedo yet, but we've started reading these Platonic dialogues, and there's a pretty punctuating point at the end of the Phaedo that the health of the body, at least for Socrates, right, the enclosure of his sensible reality, was not ultimate enough when weighed against the life and health of his soul. So his preparation for death was ultimately more important. Now, I'm not saying that the health of the body is somehow not important,
Yeah.
or that, this isn't an enjoinder or an injunction to, you know what I mean? I don't know. I'm not professing to know, but to
In fact,
me, I think
you're professing like precisely to not know.
I'm professing to not know, and I'm professing to have noticed, and not just on my own, but in conversation with you and with John and with other people, some other very, very good friends of mine that I've been talking to about this. Certainly not autonomously, not as some kind of divine revelation, but in conversation with people.
Yeah.
I'm professing to have noticed that there is a certain presumption, a certain implicit presumption, an axiomatic one that we've all collectively made that has halted something that most of us did not believe could be halted in a matter of weeks. So really powerfully.
Yeah.
And it has eluded itself as such an obvious and presumed axiom that it has gone so unquestioned.
Right.
And to me, I think we need to look at that very, very closely, because there's something very powerful about it. You and I were saying, you were saying there's something incredibly impressive about the fact that this could happen so expeditiously.
Yeah.
But at the same time, especially when we're talking about these implicit axiomatic perspectives that we live within and therefore cannot see, there's something incredibly unnerving and even terrifying about that presumption, especially when for the better part of, the last, 2,500 years or so, we've had a lot of sagacious people canonically telling us that there is something eternal about the human being that is precisely not confined to the health of the body. Right. I'm not, and you don't need to subscribe to the transmigration of the soul in order to believe that, right? That's not making any kind of supernatural claims at all, but within the ontology of our lived and felt existential experience, the philosopher is aware that there is a great deal more to the life lived, right? The unexamined life, right? So anyway, there's something about the fundaments of that presumption and how quickly and how unthinkingly I think it was acted upon. That is really a cause for a cause for a lot of things. A cause for attention, first of all, maybe a cause for concern, maybe a cause for kairos if we're all very lucky. I don't know, but well, that's the story that interests me in all of this.
Totally. Well, one, it's just like, what's interesting to me is that there can be, because I mean, the Spanish flu was what, 1916 or something like that, right?
Yeah, it was World War I. Yeah.
Like and you just look at plagues and wars and everything like that. Like, I mean, it definitely hasn't just been assumed, right? that physical health is like the end all, right? Or the measure upon which to sacrifice almost everything. So I'm struck that is just assumed, right? This is what's interesting about being in a secular culture, is that you can't really be in a secular culture. It just means that, like, in a Christian, like a medieval Christian town. Now, I'm not a Christian, right? But it's almost if I'm Western, it's almost impossible to not be.
Yeah, you are and you're not. Yeah.
But there's if you look at medieval towns, the highest that are still preserved in the originals, for years, the highest point is the church, right? It's the cross. Everything where you look up, everything's organized. Everything's explicitly about that, right?
Yes.
So there was back then, there was no question about what the hell is on top, right? Now, I could have the experience of not noticing what's on top, right?
Exactly.
That's wild.
Exactly. That's beautifully put, Guy. And a time like this throws that into distinction, because a time like this calls attention an unwitting kind of attention
Yeah.
to what is on top.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's right. You know, the steeple is no longer
Huh.
at the top of the village, right? Because
Yeah.
because a because a paradigm founded on the symbolism of self-sacrifice and suffering is
Hmm.
not philosophically consonant with the principle that the health of the body is the highest good.
Right. Right.
Now, of course, we've talked ad nauseum about the fact that we're in the throes of a time where that's in declension, right?
Yeah.
That of course that value has been eroded over the course of time. And that's precisely the point of the meaning crisis, right? Is that we've lost our conversance with the life of the spirit, and therefore the life of the body can be elevated to divine status
Elevating
in
that
its
we hold on
stead.
to. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. That's right. But I think it throws a great deal of attention to the particular state of the soul, to the particular nature of our spiritual predicament. Our response to COVID, I think, is deeply symptomatic in ways that we have really yet to fully understand, because we're still in it, and we're still having very
Yeah.
understandably, we're still having very instinctual reactions to it,
Yeah.
right? Where we want to self-preserve, fair enough. But I think
But what we
yeah.
call self, what we call what is worth preserving, right, is so
Oh, good.
interesting.
Yeah.
So
Good point.
interesting. It's just kind of like, that's one of the things I love about reading history, right? And philosophical history, all that stuff, is that you realize that there was one point with what is so self-evidently obviously true to you now was not always true, right? And you get the historicalness and finitude of your own self-evident truths about what's going on through reading history, right? Like you get a glimpse at like the non-infinite way that you've been not noticing that you've been taking reality. So it's kind of, there is this quality of like things like what we call reality, things that what we call a self, what we call uh, deeming worthy of sacrifice, like all
Mm-hmm.
of those things. Yeah, it's just so interesting to me to think about that
Yeah.
it's one of the crises, right? I think of the meaning crisis is that there's no place to shut. There's no real, with any kind of weight anymore, right? There's no institution or place that reveals the top of the thing that we're looking at that guides this, right? Now there's, but like, Hegel and all these people, um, the age of reason, where modernism comes from, it's like it definitely exposed that it's not like that's heaven, right? That like you get into all kinds of problems with that. But at the same time, when you remove that, we still act religiously. And this is kind of like
Absolutely.
what I think one of the things that you're talking about, right? Is like, oh, yeah, there's a way in which we just don't even question it. Yeah,
Yes.
it's
Yes.
interesting.
Well, that very dissonance is then its own performance of despair, right? The fact that we still act as if we still act religiously,
Yeah,
even though we are less and less concentered
yeah,
by a model of the self
yeah,
that in that affines us to a relationship with the self beyond it,
yeah,
right?
yeah. So
So the self I loved what you said, like the self that is being preserved
yeah,
in rushing to reclusion, rushing to sequestering,
uh-huh,
is not the self that is preserved
yeah,
as Socrates drinks the hemlock.
right.
The self that Socrates is preserving
Mhm.
by drinking the hemlock is not the self that we are preserving by refusing to drink the hemlock.
Yeah, yeah,
And I'm not, obviously, again, that's not like
yeah.
that's not because I'm way of advocating
Any kind
recklessness,
of,
right? But you know what I mean. Yeah.
totally. Yeah, well, definitely. Like, I don't think, and Socrates wasn't recklessly drinking that.
No.
No, like he was. That was an act of. Yeah. So let's talk about that for a second. So it's like for him to make that choice, right, in the face of that, he basically was saying, what do you think, how would you put what he was basically saying? What was the thing that was more important than his physical going onness?
Oh man. Oh man. How much do I want to fuck this up, Guy? How much do I want to fuck it up?
As much as possible. Mm-hmm. God, it's Socrates. It's paradox all the way down on some level.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I think that there is a there's so many things happening at the same time.
Yeah.
There's so many things happening at the same time.
Yeah.
But there's something gestural and, allusions and comparisons to Christ and the sacrifice of Christ are perhaps appropriate, but I'm certainly not brave enough to venture into them right now. But again, there's something about and I say gesture analogically, right? The sacrificial gesture, right? The sacrifice of the body, the logos of that gesture is a logos that embodies possibility outside of its bounds, right? It's like taking a deep lungful of what a deep proleptic lungful of what is knowingly beyond the scope of your being. And because it is knowingly beyond the scope of your being, it necessarily must be that which rearranges your values as they attempt to regather themselves around it, right? So the sacrificial gesture is somehow a kind of embodied analogic ostension toward that which is knowingly more than the immanent values around which your reality is currently organized. Right? Yeah. And, how can you be fully accommodative of that reality? It's you can't, right? Precisely because it's beyond you, right? So you have to be, as Socrates was, as the lover, right? Suspended between ignorance and wisdom. And when the ignorance becomes knowing, then it can start to appreciate anagogically, precisely because it realizes that its confines entail the presence of the very thing that it's constituted by, which is more of itself and more than itself at the same time, right? The more than itself is also the more of itself, right? In the way that the life, because Augustine has this distinction between the life of the body and the life of the soul. Sorry, I'm bouncing around like all hell here.
Well,
but he has this distinction between.
I just asked you why Socrates drank the
Yeah, so it's all your fault. You've done this to me.
Current crisis.
But Augustine has this distinction. I think, if I understand it right, it's quite possible that I don't. But he has this distinction between, the life of the body and the life of the soul. And the life of the body, I think what he means by the life of the body is not the body itself, right? But it's the animation of the body. It's the body as the body presence is the life of the soul, which is the aspect of self that exists ever beyond itself, right? Something like that exists in the anima mundi, right? In the Neoplatonic hypostases, right? So we're constituted by that which is fundamentally beyond us, fundamentally transcendent to us. But because we're constituted by it, we are refined with its properties.
Right.
And so the body, the life of the body, the life of the body becomes the embodied, enacted analogy for the intelligibility that is beyond the body, right? That's why the pragmatics of gesture are so much more encompassing of speech, of the word, logos, right? The meaning of logos as the word. The pragmatics of the semiosis of the body and its ability to perform semiosis.
Oh, because there's a sense in which you use gestures, right, to help the surplus of meaning that can't be put into just the word, right? So you're gesturing. Yeah, it's funny. It's interesting.
That's right. So it's like striking. It's like developing a conversance between the life of the body and the life of the soul, right? Which is to say, the being by which the being in body is constituted.
Totally.
And that conversance, which can only be called proleptic or a matter of faith, is something that we only know, to use the language that we use and to use John's language, right? It can only be known in participation, right? It can be known in gnosis and participatory knowing, which is why the pragmatics of ritual are so essential to its semiosis, because it's an embodied performance of patterns of intelligibility that it cannot fully accommodate, but that it partakes of, even though its partaking of them is ever and always insufficient. So there is something, so I can bringing it way back, there is something not only in the logos of Socrates' speech as he dialogues with his friends in the moments before taking the hemlock, but there is a deep and profound dramaturgy to his actual imbibing of the hemlock as a way of embodying the very analogos that he has been developing his conversance with his friends in the moments and hours, preceding his death, right? It's the preparation for death, right? Anyway, I don't know. In short, I have no idea. I have no idea.
Yeah, but that's quite hell of a no idea. Like, well, it's quite of a hell of a no.
Well, you had this beautiful you had this beautiful little. You had this I'm trying to remember it. It was I'm gonna butcher it, but we were talking earlier. We've been talking for a long time leading up to this particular moment. But at one point you said, our interaction with unknown, such that it never loses its un.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so something like that. It still remains profoundly. It still remains profoundly unknown to me. But perhaps more appreciated or more appreciable in its unknownness.
Right.
That's the best we can do. And that's the thing. I mean, that's the property of logos, right? The property of logos has the unit of discourse and its connection to the more cosmic definition of logos, right? The logos is the unity of the unifying principle of reason that binds the cosmos in continuity. That what connects one of those definitions to the other. This is part of what I've been thinking about and part of the work I'm doing with John. But it's like it's a metonymous. The logos as the word and the logos as the cosmic reason. It's a metonym. One is a metonym for the other. It's a metonymic relationship. Metonymic relationship, which is to say that one is a much abbreviated semiotic gesture for the other. And I think that's why dialogos is so profound, because what dialogos does is it animates the gesture of logos so that it appreciates its own ignorance and insufficiency, so that ignorance becomes a knowing form of ignorance that develops a relationship, a kind of animate rapport with everything it gestures to and yet does not encompass. Right. If that makes any iota of sense.
This is where you put your. I'm just thinking about my dad's, bumper sticker coffee cup AA phrase, that he always talks about, like that, all
Say,
suffering.
sorry, you cut out for me for a second. Say that again. What was
Yeah,
the bumper
when
sticker?
my dad used to always, quoting my dad, says all human suffering you can boil down to where man puts a period, where God put a question mark, right?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Of this sense of, there is this sense in with these dialogues, there is this sense in which you're always left aware of that you have been, like, both of and not yet found to something that isn't quite formed, but in a but in a an aspiring aspiration with it, right? It's really
Yeah.
embodied, right? And so
Yes. Yes.
just this sense of, like, on some level, think about this. This is just stunning to think about, right? Of so to basically, we just basically have stopped the world, right? Voluntarily, pretty much, because something was something was a period, and it wasn't even it's not even like, um it's not even seen as a period, right? Upon which we didn't notice that we're just having as the ultimate value, right? Which is, physical, our physical mortality, um you start to think about that, like, one, it makes a lot of sense in terms of all of the work on kind of transhumanism, right? On trying to break that code, and on some level of, like, that, well, if that's the top of the hierarchy, we got some work to do.
Oh, that's a good point.
Right? Like,
That's a good point.
because it's
That's
an
a good point.
intolerance for that, because if that's at the top of the hierarchy, right, and that's the thing, that if that's the end, we can't have that be the end.
Which makes so much sense, because if the health of the body, if the wellness of the body, God, wellness, the word drives me absolutely crazy. Wellness. Um, if health and wellness is a new old, it's been
Mhm.
around for a while,
Yeah.
a kind of orthodoxy,
Yeah.
then that makes the transhumanism movement a kind of neo-Gnosticism.
Interesting. Interesting. Sit.
By analogy.
Yeah.
By analogy.
Yeah.
So, like, because the Gnostics were many things, but one of which was a form of transgressive heresy to the orthodoxy, right?
Mm.
Suffused with the belief that
Mm.
that personal cultivation
Mm.
was sufficient to transcend the boundaries of enclosure
Mm.
that the orthodoxy was otherwise
Yeah.
a proponent of, to some
Yeah.
degree.
Yeah.
Right? It's breaking through the ceiling, as it were, breaking through perforating the canopy.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, the transhumanism movement seems so intuitively stunted in its particular aims. It seems so unwise intuitively for so many reasons. But what you say makes a lot of sense, that if health and wellness is a new form of a pseudo-religiosity, a pseudo-religious kind of orthodoxy that is revealed quite dramatically at the moment, held aloft as being of prime and ultimate value, then the idea that it's superable, the idea that physical limitations or mortality is superable in the form of technological appendages and other things,
Yeah.
is, I think, analogous to a kind of Gnostic belief that what was that the boundaries, that the proffered boundaries are in fact superable, insofar as they've been presented to us by an orthodoxy that holds them intact.
Yeah. Totally.
Anyway, it's a very imperfect analogy, but it's what occurred to me when you said that. I hadn't thought of it in that way before.
Right. Right. Because it's like, I guess if we look at this is just this is amazing. It's just, like, fascinating to think about this. I think this is actually this is what's the kind of stuff that's worthy of thought, is that you haven't been thinking, right? It's like, so what Heidegger said, what is worthy of thought today, what is most worthy of thought today is that we haven't yet begun thinking. Right? You really get it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Absolutely.
And there's so what exactly, so on one level it's physical demise, right? That seems to be the thing that was worth stopping everything, right? Unquestionably, the health of the body and ensuring the health of the body being kind of the top of it. Now, what's interesting about that is, what does that reveal about what we view as the body, right? By definition, it's kind of like the body is that which dies, right? It's kind of like, that's what kind of makes it a body and not a rock or something. It's finite.
Mm-hmm.
So on some level, like, there is this way where what's at the top is by definition almost it's its end, right? But like, not an end as beyond. It's like the end. Like, what does it say? Both like what we call physical body. Do we really mean, like, when we refer to the physical body, what does it mean to have that be a god, right? What are we actually conceiving of it when we don't notice that we're conceiving of it as a particular way? What is the body? What is health, right? All these kinds of things, right? And two is like, what does it mean, right, to have it there? What does it mean to have it there? It's so interesting to think that, and to have that be the organizing context.
Yeah.
If what we're playing with here, I want to emphasize playing, right?
And right. And what and what then does it imply?
Yeah.
What then does it imply?
Yeah.
If something that is something whose perhaps most incommensurable property is finitude,
Yeah.
is then invested with the divinity of infinitude.
Right. Yeah. Is what we sacrifice for that. It's like, it's really interesting. I mean, it's because there's something about, like, when I think about this, is there's something about like the way so much process, I don't know if this is quite the connection, but the way that, like, so like in technology, for example, in the technological way of being, I'll say, right? Not necessarily technology, but like what makes something technological. And, bringing Heidegger here about where he talks about, like, well, we are in the age where the understanding of that which is a technological understanding, meaning that we say it's real, and it be to the degree that it's a position that defines other positions and inframes them, right? So it's
right,
like
a meta meeting system.
Yeah, totally. So it's like where it's more of the sense of what you are, what I am, what everything that is, by virtue of which it is the understanding of that is that which is that which can be exploited, optimized, utilized, right? Extracted. That's the thing about technology. So it's not like a windmill produces electricity. If you think about an old windmill, right? There's a way in which with a windmill, it uses the wind, right, to propel the thing to create electricity, but it keeps the wind intact.
It partakes of the wind.
If anything, it partakes of it,
but it doesn't possess it.
Right?
Yeah.
It animates it, articulates it in some way. That's why it's kind of beautiful to think of a windmill, right? Like,
right. It is animated by it. Yeah.
Well, what do
Yeah.
you think about, like, for example, nuclear energy, which is way more technological? Actually, it breaks apart nucleons, right? So there's this kind of
Right.
quality where it's not gathering and partaking of something, it's extracting something, it's changing something out of it, right? So
Yes.
it's not developing
Yes.
energy, right? It's
Yes.
like it's like
Yes.
sucking it out. And that what
Yes.
and what's crazy about that, well, when you think about it, is like, one is that it's our understand, if Heidegger's correct, right, about this, if we kind of follow his notion of it, I am too, you are too, everything that is, right, that we can call is, shows up and is based on virtue of which, the understanding of which is that it is a resource.
Yeah.
Our bodies is a resource, right? Like physicality is a resource. Like, let's and there's, it's interesting because you think about like the whole thing, and I mean I love this stuff, but like mind hacking, this notion of body hacking, kind of this kind of sense of like where there is a position, there's a like a turn. This used to be really fringe, and now this is, you can see it
Yeah.
more and more and more and more present. We're just referring
Yeah.
to the body is a resource that you hack,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And again, hacking
Like,
to me,
how much we can get,
hacking also, once again,
yes,
yep. Once again, evocative of Gnosticism to me. Hacking, finding the secret code, finding the secret intervention.
interesting. And so with Gnosticism, the shadow of Gnosticism, right, where you would say Gnosticism loses its way, if you will, right? Because there's like a real, like there's also Gnosticism, which is, brilliant in a lot of ways. Which
Oh,
is
absolutely. Yeah.
Gnosticism?
I just mean, yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
There's a way in which you can invoke it with deep reverence and
yeah,
sapience. Yes, it's true. I'm using a particular critical,
right.
exactly. Taking a
Well,
particular instance of it critically.
and just to, I want to play with that for a second. So with Gnosticism, because I still have a hard time kind of getting my head around what Gnosticism really is, but the if it's connected in the way that, right, the good side of Gnosticism, for lack of a better
Mhm.
term, what's going on in Gnosticism that makes it connected and considerate of the whole, right, versus the shadow side of it? What is the difference that makes that difference?
Well, I certainly don't pretend for an instant to be an expert. My understanding of it, my understanding of the Gnostic quest, insofar as its wisdom is concerned, is precisely that it is chiefly concerned with anagoge. Right, the Gnostic quest is the anagogic quest fundamentally. If I was to, like,
Yeah,
very crudely distill it down to a particular property, a particular value, it would be anagoge. Anagoge is the Gnostic quest.
and anagoge, if you're, for people who are not familiar with an anagoge is what?
It's a kind of divine ascension. It's climbing the Platonic ladder, as it were. It's the appreciating affinity of the person to their divine aspect,
Yeah,
such that they become more in likeness to their divine nature, and so become more in likeness to the divine itself. It is the apotheosis
yeah,
project.
right.
Yeah,
Totally.
that's my understanding of it. But the thing is that, I mean, that I think we could very comfortably equate with the notion of gnosis itself, insofar as, the kind of gnosis that the Neoplatonic sense of gnosis that we've discussed in many of these dialogues. I think that the more critical use of the term Gnosticism, and what John and I have talked about in terms of neo-Gnosticism, is that the mythos, the cosmology of Gnosticism, and I'm talking about Gnosticism as though it's somehow one unified movement. And of course, that's not true. It's
Yeah,
distributed and it's endlessly varied
yeah,
in its forms. So I don't mean to talk about it univocally. It's not univocal. But the cosmologies around Gnosticism that have to
yeah,
do with incarceration by the demiurgic force, that kind of
yeah,
that keeps us enclosed, that
yeah,
keeps us obfuscated, that keeps us blind to reality. Those cosmologies are richly cast with all kinds of characters and narratives that in I think in the modern context would manifest as a kind of deeply conspiratorial thinking. And so when we use sort of the term neo-Gnosticism, I think in the way that John and I use it, it has much to do with the casting forth of conspiratorial narratives,
right,
as a way of explaining the anomalous nature of aporetic experience or intercategorical experience, right? So that when something happens like this, right, like the COVID situation that brings everything to a halt and starts to like tectonically undermine our models of reality, one's instinct or one reaction to it, just as it has been, erstwhile for the meaning crisis as a whole, is to foist this aporia with a series of narratives attempting to account for the sudden vacancy that has opened beneath us. And that, that the projecting of an alternate narrative to try and reclasp, reforge unity and coherence out of something that has fundamentally lost its unity and lost its coherence. And so that attempt, just as the transhumanism is, right, that attempt to kind of somehow forcibly insert some kind of intervention to make sense of a sudden finitude, a sudden, a sudden gap, a sudden loss, a sudden sense of loss, is something that we might describe as a form of neo-Gnosticism.
Wow, interesting. So the self-enclosedness, right, of Gnosticism, right, it's kind of a form of idolatry. It sounds like on some level, like idolatry.
It certainly can be. Yeah, I think so. I think it certainly can be.
That sense in which. So I guess, another way that we could look at it, just playing with this again, of like, okay, so what's atop is like, there's an idolatry of the body, of physicality. That's even
absolutely.
It's even economy, right?
Yeah. Oh, it has. I mean, it has decisively surpassed economy. That's the whole point. Yeah. And it's decisively surpassed, sociability, and it's decisively surpassed all kinds of things, right? In the moment. Yeah. And I think, again, even as I say it, I feel heretical and transgressive, because of course, how could you question? Like, I feel guilty even for saying it. And I want to be attentive to that reaction as I say, the apotheosization of the body is a kind of idolatry. And then someone might say, well, Chris, don't you want to be healthy? Like, of course I do. Of course I do. Don't you want your family to be healthy? What? Of course I do. But so there's a heresy, immediate heresy.
Yes. Healthy for the sake of, in service of, even that, just like having health as an end.
Exactly. And there's the unexamined life question again, right?
Exactly.
Yes. Health in service of, I think Northrop Frye has a getting back to this idea of the logos, the metonymy of logos. And its relationship to the greater logos, the logos of moreness, as John has been calling it, is that, there's a difference between an identity relationship, a metaphor as an identity relationship, this is that, or a metonymic relationship, which is this is put for that. This is put for that.
Right.
So to me, the life of the body, the health of the body, is put for a value that is beyond it. Right? It is put for a value that is beyond it. And that is precisely the opposite of idolatry, right? That's the difference between the idolatrous individual and the apostle, right? The apostle is put for put in service of what is fundamental, of what is constitutive of it, and what is also beyond it.
Right.
Guy, I'm sorry. I just have to be attentive. I'm running a bit tight on time, so I think I might have to. I think I might have to dash.
Totally bring this to it. Actually,
We didn't get to reading Plato,
oh my
but we
God,
did dance around him.
4:30 here.
Yeah.
Yes, totally. That's
we
fine.
we hit recording in the last half hour of a
Yeah,
conversation. We were talking for a
yeah,
while.
totally. So yeah,
Um,
okay, my friend. So hey, let me
so
go ahead and
so
press
I'm sorry.
stop record.